like to call to order the July 19th, 2017 special meeting of the City Council. Even though it's not on our agenda, we are going to start with the pledge tonight. And Mr. Daly, if you would please come to the podium to lead us in the pledge. Everybody else, please rise.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Daly. Do we need to do a roll call? It's not on our agenda, but we always do it. Could we do a roll call, please?
Councilmember Cook.
here.
Councilmember Harrington.
Here.
Councilmember Agramonte.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Edwards.
Yes.
Mayor Hunley.
Here.
Thank you.
So tonight is a continuation of the discussion of the appeal of the Planning Commission's decision to certify the EIR for the Hotel Sonoma project. This item was continued from June 22nd. As some of you remember, after hearing public comments per the request of the appellants and the applicant, the City Council closed the public hearing and continued the item to this evening for council consideration, deliberation, and direction. The appeal discussion is limited to the adequacy of the EIR. The perceived merits of the project and potential approval or denial of the project is still not under consideration. So tonight we are not talking about whether we like or do not like the project. We are focused purely on the environmental impact report. In terms of what the process is, this is going to be a little bit different from what we're used to, so I'm going to lay it out for you. First, we are going to hear a short staff report. Then the council is going to have an opportunity to ask questions. And then the council is going to have a discussion based on all of the information that we heard at the last meeting during the public hearing. And then at that point, we're going to take a straw poll and see where we are headed. And then after that, we will have a opportunity for public comment. And that will be focused on if the council decides to move this towards recirculation or something like that, then it's going to be directed more towards what's going to happen in the future. So no one from the public is going to be able to speak until we get to that point. And then, so if council were to decide to deny the appeal and certify the EIR, then there would likely not be a need for public comment about the EIR itself. But if there's going to be revisions or recirculation, then council might choose to allow a space for public comment at tonight's meeting regarding council direction on staff items to be considered for revision in the EIR. And last, the council would consider motions on the item and bring this to a conclusion. Any motion would take the form of direction to staff, who would then prepare a resolution implementing the council's direction for adoption at a subsequent meeting. So we are going to start with our planning director, who is going to give us a report.
Yes, and I heard the word short used in describing this report, and I'm going to stick with that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't want to forget something that I did at the last meeting, which is to introduce some guests tonight who are with us to help out with this discussion as needed. With me tonight is Steve Nowak of PlaceWorks. PlaceWorks is the prime environmental consultant who has prepared the EIR for this project that's under consideration at this time. And with us also is Zach Matley of WTrans. WTrans is the traffic consultant for the EIR. So we thank them for being here tonight. There's already been an extensive background presentation on this project. I do want to give a little bit of background just for purposes of this staff report before getting into just what the basic options are that are before the City Council, and also to talk about just some late-breaking items. So to begin, the project under discussion, the Hotel Sonoma development, has been undergoing environmental review since 2012, and as part of that process, an environmental impact report was prepared to evaluate the physical impacts of the project on the environment. And that EIR is intended to constitute the environmental evaluation of the project that's required under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. That process of environmental review has to be completed before consideration can be given to the approval of planning entitlements such as a use permit. And we've emphasized before, and I'm sure we will again, that the environmental review process is informational. It's intended to provide information on potential project impacts on the physical environment as an aid to the public and to decision makers such as the Planning Commission and the City Council. But this process ultimately does not limit the discretion of the decision makers to deny, approve with conditions, or modify a project when it comes time for the actual project review. Now, the EIR preparation process is relatively complicated. It includes a number of steps that we reviewed at the previous meeting. And just to cut to the chase, the response to comments document, which is the last major phase in the process, was completed in October of 2016. And in summary, while the EIR for this project found that it could result in significant environmental impacts in several areas, mitigation measures were identified that would reduce potential impacts to a less than significant level in each case. And following a public hearing that was held in April, on a vote of 5-1, the Planning Commission voted to certify the EIR that was prepared for the project. And certification of an EIR, just to be clear, represents a determination by the Planning Commission that the EIR was prepared in accordance with the California Environmental Quality Act and that it adequately discloses potential impacts, mitigation measures, and alternatives. That decision to certify the EIR has been appealed and is now before the City Council, and at your meeting of June 22nd, the Council held a public hearing on the appeal. After hearing public comments and per the request of the appellants and the applicant, the Council closed the public hearing and continued the item for Council consideration, deliberation, and direction to this meeting tonight. In terms of the scope of review and the record of appeal, as noted already by the Mayor, the appeal discussion is limited to the adequacy of the EIR, and the perceived merits of the project and potential approval or denial of the project are not under consideration at this time. As far as the record is concerned, the record of the appeal consists of all of the materials developed and presented in the course of the preparation and consideration of the EIR, as well as all comments received, both written and oral, up to the close of the public hearing on June 22nd. So information presented following the close of the public hearing is not considered to be part of the public record under consideration by the Council. However, the Council may ask questions of staff and of the EIR consultants at this meeting. And in that regard, staff has reviewed the specific questions raised by members of the public during the hearing and is prepared to provide responses if the Council so directs at this meeting tonight. So, in essence, the issue before the Council is the certification of the EIR, and is set forth in the California Environmental Quality Act, and EIR has three purposes. The first is to fully disclose the potential environmental impacts of the project. The second is to identify mitigation measures and project alternatives aimed at avoiding environmental impacts or reducing them to a level of insignificance. And the third is to provide decision makers with the basis for making an informed decision as to the environmental consequences of the project. So that is the purpose of the document, and the essence of certifying the document is that it's a finding that those purposes have been fulfilled. This means that, in essence, the Council has two options. One would be to deny the appeal and to certify the EIR. In denying the appeal, the Council would be concurring with the decision of the Planning Commission that the EIR was prepared in accordance with CEQA and that it adequately serves to inform decision makers and the public of the potential impacts of the project on the environment. Under this option, the Council would not only deny the appeal, it would also have to take affirmative action to certify the EIR. Because the Council in this process needs to make its own findings. It can't simply rely on the action that was taken by the Planning Commission now that this item is before you. A decision to deny the appeal and certify the EIR could include additional revisions and clarifications to the document if directed by the City Council, as long as those didn't introduce new areas of impact or new alternatives, because those kinds of changes would actually require the revision and recirculation of the EIR, which is the second option. Under that option, the Council would find that revisions are needed to the EIR in order to allow it to serve as an adequate informational document. The EIR would be revised and then recirculated for comment. Recirculation could be limited to the specific chapters that are revised, or it could involve the entire document, but either way, the basic process would be the same as that used for the original EIR in many instances. First, a document setting forth the revisions would be prepared and circulated for comment. Second, following the conclusion of the comment period, a response to comments would be prepared. And then lastly, the revised EIR response to comments would be considered for certification. Something that has obvious bearing on these options is correspondence received following the June hearing from the attorney representing the applicants. In that letter, the request was made that the city amend and recirculate the EIR by adding additional alternatives, thereby allowing consideration of an alternative with a residential component and consolidating the changes made to the transportation and traffic chapter over the course of the EIR preparation process. So that is a request by the applicants themselves. And in that regard, just moving on to the staff recommendation, while staff had previously recommended that the City Council deny the appeal and certify the EIR, a recommendation that was based on staff's assessment and the concurrence of the Planning Commission that the EIR is an adequate informational document, we've given careful consideration to the information presented as part of the public hearing process, as well as this recent request by the applicants. And we have to agree the clarification of some of the information in the EIR, including an increase in the range of alternatives examined, would improve the EIR as an informational document for the public, the city, and the applicant. Based on those factors, staff recommends that the EIR be amended and recirculated. And if that direction is given, staff would return with an implementing resolution and associated findings for adoption by the council at its meeting of August 21st, 2017. Now, for moving on, I'd like to address, along with Veronica Nebb from the City Attorney's Office, a couple of items that this recommendation raises in terms of issues. One has to do with the question of what exactly is this process that is being followed. In the staff report, we're careful to call this the revision and recirculation of the EIR. And that's because the EIR would need to either be certified by the council, and once you're making a finding that the EIR is an adequate document and doesn't need any more changes, or you're making a finding that there are areas where the EIR needs to be supplemented, potentially revised, and that those areas rise to a level where recirculation is necessary. So that is the process that's before the council tonight under that option. A supplemental environmental impact report is only prepared when following the certification of an EIR. And while the Planning Commission has certified the EIR, the council hasn't. And the appeal before the City Council, in essence, is whether or not to take that action. So we're convinced that revision and recirculation is the appropriate option under the circumstances. That question is not directly related to this next issue, which just has to do with the question of what's been referred to as jurisdiction. In other words, should the City Council retain jurisdiction over the EIR, since this is an appeal that's before you now? And in the case of recirculation and revision, should it just simply go directly back to the City Council for review? Or should it go to the Planning Commission? So those are the two options under this question of jurisdiction. And there are different implications associated with those options, including that of the schedule. And we are showing in this slide basically the steps that are associated with the two options. Under option one, the revised EIR is referred to the Planning Commission. So this revised document is prepared, it's circulated for comments. There's a Planning Commission public hearing. After the conclusion of the comment period, responses to comments are prepared, and the Planning Commission would then hear the EIR and use permit in another public hearing. Presumably, there would be a council hearing on appeal. Under the second option, the council would retain jurisdiction over the EIR. In that option, it's the council that holds the hearing during the response to comments period, and the council would hold then a subsequent hearing as to whether or not to certify the revised document once the response to comments has been prepared. The Planning Commission would then become involved following the conclusion of that process, at which time the Commission would review the use permit based on this revised EIR. And then presumably there would be a council hearing upon appeal. So there is actually an extra step under this option, which increases the amount of time that it takes somewhat. And it also introduces a wild card in the sense that following council certification of the revised EIR, similar to what happened in this go-around, there's potentially litigation that could be filed, which would suspend the process until that was resolved. So we try to kind of summarize some of the considerations associated with this jurisdiction issue in this next slide. And at this point, I would like to ask Veronica to weigh in both on the issue of revision and recirculation versus supplemental, and also this question of jurisdiction. Thank you.
So I'd be happy to do that. I think subsequent to the staff report coming out and the pieces of correspondence that came to the council with regard to the modification of the staff recommendation and the request of the applicant, we've received a few letters, I think, that sort of confused and potentially clouded up the issue of what is it that you have in front of you relative to your options, which I think David adequately described. And sort of what is the difference between what staff is suggesting you do and some comments that were received suggesting that a supplemental EIR was the way to go. I want to be clear that you do not prepare a supplemental or a subsequent EIR unless the EIR is certified. Under CEQA Guidelines Section 15162, there are findings that must be made relative to a certified EIR that then guides what level of subsequent document is prepared if there are changes or new information. The problem with that issue is that unless the council certifies the EIR, no supplement or subsequent environmental impact report is proper under CEQA. If the council certifies the EIR, still no subsequent or supplemental document is proper under CEQA, because if you certify the EIR, you must find that it is adequate as it stands today. So we never really get to that question of subsequent or supplemental document under CEQA. It is either a revision to this EIR to make it adequate, or the document is adequate as it stands and you certify it. Those are the only two choices. So with regard to that, you do have some options before you as to what you do with it if you do decide to prepare changes to the document and recirculate the document. Those options are, as David reiterated earlier, referring the revised EIR to the Planning Commission or retaining jurisdiction over the current EIR. Either way, the council has the opportunity to make a choice as to which of those you wish to accomplish. The question for you is sort of how much of this process does the council wish to do versus have the Planning Commission do, which is more typical. I think that one of the benefits of having the Planning Commission undertake it, or one of the pluses, if you will, is that it provides the opportunity to amend or change the project at the same time and lets the public comment on either one. So as we heard a lot during the public hearing, both before the Planning Commission and the City Council, sometimes the public is talking about the project, sometimes it's actually talking about the EIR, and it's difficult for the public agency to explain, all right, we're only talking about the environmental document now. We might have other subsequent project changes, but those are for another time and another hearing. Sometimes the public has a hard time evaluating, well, is the document adequate if we are talking about some project changes? There's also the case that if the project comes forward and you change the project when the project itself comes forward, then you have to evaluate, do those changes require any changes to the environmental document yet again? So it becomes this sort of circular process potentially. Now, if no changes to the project happen, or if the environmental document already covers those changes, you don't have that issue. But that issue is possible when they're separated with the Planning Commission having jurisdiction over the use permit and the City Council having jurisdiction over the EIR. That said, you have some continuity of environmental review. If you keep it before the council knows what it thinks needs to be changed in the document. You have the opportunity to each weigh in on that. And as a whole, not sort of get into a question of whether or not then the planning commission or staff, however, missed something that the council wanted to see modified in the EIR. So there are pluses and minuses either way. If the council has questions on that and wants to talk about it in more detail, once you've sort of deliberated and have some desire to talk more about the pros and cons, or whether or not there are options for giving specific direction back, certainly we can talk about that at that time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, who has questions? Councilwoman Harrington?
So I'm not sure I heard you correctly, but I think the two options you said were either deny the appeal and certify the EIR or revise the EIR, but I did not hear you say uphold the appeal.
Oh,
That is
excuse me, yes, under that option, the appeal would be upheld.
Right, so the
Excuse me.
appeal is upheld, and then the EIR process has to be, we're basically looking at a new document in some form with different information on the areas we're talking about.
Right, updated information on the areas we're talking about, and certainly one of the things that the staff has recommended in the revised staff report is to add alternatives to the document that would provide you, both the Planning Commission and the City Council, some additional options at the point that you consider the project on its merits.
And then my other question with regard to the use permit, what I don't think makes any sense to me is that you're saying that if the EIR and the use permit are separated, that changes made to the use permit that aren't tied with the EIR would be more difficult, but the exact same, assuming that it's all going to be appealed ultimately, the use permit will be before the City Council will have jurisdiction over both, and any changes that we require under the use permit will be made in this room. So doesn't really make any sense to me.
So the use permit does not come to the council until it is considered by the Planning Commission, and it will not come to the council at all if it is not appealed. So I think the difficulty or the potential disconnect is if the Planning Commission does something with the use permit that wasn't, how do I put this, contemplated in the environmental document, you create another new additional issue. Where if the two documents are together, both before the Planning Commission and then potentially on appeal to the council, at least you have that continuity between the two documents.
But practically speaking, given the timeline of this project, the use permit, whether it's approved or denied, will be appealed by someone, either side. I would
Probably.
say there's a 99.8% certainty that will happen. And so at that time, whatever requirements are put on the use permit and the effect they have on the environmental impact report will be right here. It won't be at the Planning Commission.
Except that you will have already certified the environmental impact report because you have to certify it before it goes back to the Planning Commission.
Right, and if there's a requirement made, so the obvious, thing we're talking about, if there is a requirement for housing which wasn't evaluated in the EIR and that was part of the use permit, then an additional EIR for that actual project, which is different than the project before us, would have to be done.
But potentially that is true, and I think that's the, for lack of a better word, the downside is now you're looking at a third environmental document. And it's not that it's impossible, I grant you completely. It is not that it is impossible. It's just that then you're redoing the document potentially a third time if that eventuality happens. Yeah, okay.
Ms. Agramonte?
My question is with respect to, if it comes to the council rather than the to the planning commission rather than the council, I think there are only 4 members now, is that right? I don't know, how many members are now on the planning?
Well, there are 5 members, and that said, and I'd certainly like the city manager to weigh in on this, I think that we would have the commission issue resolved by the time that this comes forward.
Because I think that would be a problem, wouldn't it? Do we normally have, is it 7? I'm sorry.
We normally have 7 planning commissioners.
Okay, so I think that might lead to a problem if we didn't have the complete.
Yeah, Councilmember Agarmati, I believe, I have no doubt that we will have resolution and whatever the final direction of council implemented with, the sitting planning commission by the time that this would be coming back to a planning commission in early 2018.
Thank you.
So I have a few questions. So the decision that we're making now, so it seems like everyone's sort of on board with the idea of going back, sprucing it up, recirculating, and then coming back. So as far as the decisions that need to be made, I guess the first one is the actual decision on the appeal, and then the second is what's going to happen after that. So as far as the discussion now, are we talking about what would happen, sending it back, like what we want in it, or what we want clarified, or the questions we had about things that are existing in there? Because I had from the last meeting some specific questions about items in it. Just don't know when the most appropriate time is to talk about them or ask about them.
Right now.
Right now.
All right, so I have some questions. So my first question is, with regard to the alternatives, which it sounds like you're suggesting that we expand the alternatives, what would be the basis on the suggestions you might have for the alternatives? And in order for there to be an alternative added, does it have to be related to an unmitigated issue or an unmitigated impact from the project?
I don't think that it needs to be that strictly defined in terms of identifying the range of alternatives. In my view, for example, a housing component alternative isn't strictly necessary to mitigate an impact. Whether or not, someone agrees or disagrees with that could be debated, but even under that assumption, you could add an alternative that incorporates a residential component, as long as it can be designed to, maintain in some form or another the basic objectives of the project.
So I'd like to add to that because I think this is a particularly confusing area that I'd like to try to clarify. Not sure I'll be successful, but in general, there's 2 real goals of alternatives, and one is the legal goal, satisfying CEQA. And under CEQA, what the legal goal is that an alternative that you suggest or that you choose, the range of alternatives in the document, are to be designed to mitigate impacts of the project principle, meaning the main project that is being proposed. So what you had heard from staff relative to, for instance, a housing alternative was, well, there weren't impacts that staff felt existed relative to housing that needed to be mitigated with a housing alternative. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that, that was staff's position relative to that issue. So a housing alternative may or may not reduce impacts. If it doesn't reduce impacts, then adding that alternative isn't part of your reasonable range under CEQA for purposes of making a determination on the adequacy of the alternatives analysis. But it may serve another purpose. And that other purpose is still equally important oftentimes to the decision-making body. And that other purpose is, have we also had the document analyze the impacts of a project we might actually want to approve, or a change that we might want to make to the project? And this goes back to that bouncing back and forth between project changes and the environmental document. So oftentimes if you have a thought that another project or another iteration of the project that could have different impacts might be something you might want to consider. While it wouldn't necessarily serve that CEQA purpose of mitigating impacts, it would serve the disclosure requirements of CEQA. So it can, in fact, be valuable to have that alternative in the document. Notwithstanding that, staff has looked at the alternatives in the document, and in light of the public hearing and some other discussion, adding a housing component alternative would serve that second purpose. It may or may not serve the first purpose, and we won't know that for sure until the alternative is evaluated to see whether it has greater or lesser impacts. But we probably do want to also add a less dense alternative or less reduced project alternative in order to try to address that question of lessening impacts. So that's why you have this suggestion of two potential additional alternatives to be examined in the document to get you a broader range of alternatives in the document. I hope that clarifies that question.
Yeah, my question was, where the space was between what's required by the impacts and then where we're limited as a council, like where our sort of discretion lives. But that was helpful. Another question is related to, some people were talking about piecemealing, and my understanding is that the offices for the hotel were going to be off-site, and I was wondering about how they were included into it and if they will be considered in the future.
Well, I'll take a first shot at this. If existing office spaces, wherever they might be, are used for office purposes, that doesn't create any impacts that are subject to environmental review. For example, if a hotel chooses to off-site its bookkeeping to a bookkeeper somewhere, that's an existing service. It's located in some existing building, and it doesn't raise any question of environmental review related to the project.
And so that's because the building that they would go into is already being used for some similar purpose?
Correct.
Okay. Do you have a question?
Just on that.
Go for it.
So with regard to piecemealing, if I wanted to build a off-site office space for my hotel, and I got that approved first, knowing that I was going to build the hotel, and it was all part of my business plan to have my off-site, my office, my back office in that office building, would that be piecemealing?
If that was a requirement of the other element of your project, and that was a specific intent, then yeah, that would be piecemealing.
Okay, so how is that discovered?
Well, I think it's discovered in part just through, evaluating the project narrative and comparing that to just the feasibility of what is in front of you as a project. For example, a project narrative could make all kinds of claims about how this is going to work and that will work. This project narrative states that, and this is just like a minor example, this project narrative states that all laundry and house services are going to be provided on site. So we look at the site plan and we determine, yeah, there's an area in the basement where laundry services can be performed. So, that can be validated. If it weren't, it couldn't be.
So in general, this is a little bit, I'll just add a little bit to that. This is a little bit about the independent utility test, which is essentially, I'll call it a doctrine for lack of a better word, developed through case law that essentially says that if the projects are inextricably, boy, that's a tough word, intertwined, and they don't have utility independent of one another, then definitely you're looking at a piecemealing situation. If, however, the projects are, an example, I happen to be a developer in town and I'm building an office project over here and I'm building a hotel project over here and I'm building a housing project 3 blocks away. Well, I might be the same applicant, but unless those projects are dependent upon one another, meaning they have no independent utility of each other, I can apply for one, then the other, and then the other as 3 independent projects. Now, if in fact they're not independent, meaning one can't go forward without the other because it is literally dependent upon the other, then that would still be piecemealing. But if they are not interdependent, then the piecemealing argument does not really apply.
Does parking count in that?
If off-site parking would be the same thing. If you needed the off-site parking, so I had to construct a parking garage as an example in order to address the parking of a project, then yes, that it would be a dependent secondary project that you would need to examine in as part of the project principle because you needed that parking at that other site in order to satisfy your parking requirements.
And it had to be constructed.
But yes, so remember that SEQ was about physical impacts. So we'll use parking as an example. If that parking garage is already constructed, you need to evaluate the trips to go there and use it, but the impacts associated with the construction of the garage itself would not be examined because it's already there.
And I guess I would just add one more comment. The expansion of the Lynch Building was represented to staff and to the Planning Commission as an expansion that would accommodate offices for a business known as Crave and also offices for the Sonoma Index Tribune. And it was not represented as having any connection in terms of office space with regard to the proposed hotel. And if there are questions or skepticism about those representations, then certainly we can look into that issue further.
All right, my next question is about delivery trucks. And it seems like when we've talked about it, it's been more of like a sort of like common sense analysis, but I'm wondering if there's been any sort of formal analysis or plan of what time they're going to be there, where they're going to park, what the impact of that's going to be, and if not, is that something that could be hypothetically in a future revision?
Sure. Well, in terms of what's in there right now, the draft EIR looks at delivery trucks in the traffic and transportation section and looks at it from a variety of ways, including an evaluation of just where different turning movements can be accommodated for trucks of different sizes. So, for example, while a loading area has been proposed off of First Street West, not all trucks would necessarily have to offload there because, based on this engineering evaluation, trucks of up to 20 feet can be accommodated using the West Napa Street entrance. So that's something that, that has been reviewed and just validated through this engineering review. In terms of how trucks can operate at that location, either at First Street West or West Napa Street, a lot of the discussion in the EIR is about how trucks unload today on the plaza, including in the vicinity of the project. So, for example, the Red Grape, which is at the corner of West Napa Street and First Street West, has 105 indoor seats. The Sonoma Grill, which is down the street on West Napa Street, has 79 indoor seats. Those are existing restaurants. They take deliveries, as other restaurants do in Sonoma, and typically those occur in the morning, and typically those don't appear to create significant problems. The issue is addressed also in the parking management plan that was proposed by the applicants, which states that the hotel would not accept large truck deliveries after 10 a.m. But if there's more quantification that the council would desire in terms of, for example, the frequency of large truck deliveries, then that can be included in any subsequent revisions.
All right, thank you. So next one, I have some questions about the bump outs. First, so it seems like the bump outs appeared after the Planning Commission certified the EIR and before the appeal, like somewhere in there. So I'd like to know when they started being discussed in the scope of this project. And then with that as an element, it seems like there's questions like, what are they going to look like? Who's going to design them? How much is it going to cost? What's the effect on the historic plaza? So how much analysis has been done about the bump outs?
Well, first, that concept was developed actually independently of this project through the review of the circulation element update. That's when that concept first appeared, because there have been repeated concerns raised over the years about how pedestrians use that intersection and the desire to improve that intersection to better serve pedestrians. So that's something that was specifically looked at in the update of the circulation element. With respect to how it when it first came about in discussion as far as the environmental review of this project is concerned, that was actually identified, and please correct me if I'm wrong, as a mitigation measure in the draft EIR. So it is not something that came about after the circulation of the draft EIR. It is referenced in the draft EIR.
So, just Just a clarification on that point. In the draft EIR, that mitigation measure was a mitigation measure addressed to pedestrian safety as opposed to a mitigation measure addressed to traffic impacts. The mitigation measure was applied to traffic impacts, as if I recall correctly, in the response to comments document. In other words, the response to comments and responding to a comment on traffic said, well, this mitigation measure that was already in the project in the draft EIR addressed to pedestrian safety would also serve this other purpose and would result in a reduction of delay at the intersection due to the distance reduction for a pedestrian to cross the street. So while the measure was already there, it was applied for a different purpose subsequent to the draft EIR, but before certification.
That's right. Now, in terms of the cost, that's unknown at this time. The design would be developed by a qualified traffic engineer. It would be subject to the review and approval of the city engineer and Caltrans. In terms of their appearance, curb bowouts are essentially widened sidewalk areas that encroach upon what is currently paved roadway. And as demonstrated by the curb bowouts that were implemented at Broadway West Napa Street, that type of improvement would not change the visual character of the environment in a manner that would diminish the historic significance of the plaza. Certainly the bowouts at Broadway did not do that, and there's no reason to believe that bowouts at this location would either. And in fact, depending on how they're designed, they could actually increase the landscaped area of the plaza somewhat.
And so, since the bump outs are being used to offset this increase in traffic at the First Street West, Napa Street intersection, how do we know that the simulation used to calculate these numbers is correct? Because it seemed like it was kind of added at the end, and this like computer machine crunched out these numbers, and it's all awesome. So how do we know that this is going to do what the computer says it's going to do?
Well, I'm going to say that the guy who performed that simulation analysis is with us tonight, so I'm going to let him answer that question.
I think I lucked out a little bit. Obviously, coming into this, Daleen, who you've seen in prior meetings, has 4+ years of mental Rolodex on this project, and I'm kind of coming here at the end because she's on vacation right now. But I did help with the simulation part, so good question. The simulation was done. We already know qualitatively that if you reduce the pedestrian crossing distance, the pedestrian's exposure to moving traffic is less, the amount of time that it takes a pedestrian to cross the street is less, and the amount of time that a driver has to stop for a pedestrian crossing the street is also less. Technically, if a pedestrian steps into a crosswalk, a driver is supposed to stop for them. Whether they do or not is another question. So what we're doing by implementing the bulb outs is you're really reducing that pedestrian crossing width, and that reduces their exposure to automobile traffic, but it also changes driver behavior because a pedestrian can come quite a ways out before the driver has to actually stop. They're in a protected curb sidewalk space. So with the simulation, again, standard LOS methodologies aren't sensitive enough to do this, but with the simulation, it actually takes into account how long that distance is that the pedestrian is crossing the street, and it will show the cars actually start to yield to the pedestrian as soon as they step off that curb. So if you're reducing the distance between the curbs, there's less impact to traffic flow. So by doing that, looking at what is it right now versus what would it be with bulb outs installed, we're able to determine an order of magnitude difference and show that there would be a decrease in delay, and it did end up being enough to offset the delay that the project would contribute to that intersection. Just tapping onto another component of that, while it's not designed, we did have some concept level drawings that were done as part of the circulation element, and then we did make sure to assume that there would be room for both vehicle travel lanes in each direction plus bicycle lanes in each direction as well. If there weren't going to be future bicycle lanes, which whether they're going to be implemented or not, we don't know, but we would have to make sure that there's at least enough width to provide those future bike lanes because they are called out in the city's bike plan. If we didn't have those, we could make it even narrower and get an even better improvement, but we didn't. We assumed that there would be bike lanes ultimately provided there.
I would just add that the simulation is performed 3 times and the results average, so it's not just a one-off.
We do 10 runs actually, because each simulation is going to be different, just like real world. If you go out and look at something every day, it's going to be a little different. So the simulation randomly seeds the network with the actual traffic volumes and the number of pedestrians, and is able to, each run is going to be a little different. But when you do 10 of them and average them, you get a good baseline that's normalized.
And has like real life examples supported what the simulations are showing? Like that a bulb out does in fact reduce traffic because of shorter pedestrian crossing?
Yeah, in
real life.
concept, we know that reducing those pedestrian crossing distances both helps the pedestrian circulation as well as vehicle circulation. One nuance to that is if you're in a higher speed location where there's a ton of right turning traffic, it can slow the right turning traffic down. But that's not a circumstance at this intersection. There's not a lot of right turning volume. It's relatively low. So in this circumstance, we would certainly expect it to be an improvement.
All right.
Just conceptually, when you narrow the size of the street, doesn't that inherently slow down the cars? Aren't you narrowing it substantially by having the intersection smaller and also adding the bike lane?
So right now, there's still only one travel lane in each direction, whether there's bulb outs or not. Right now, that space is, I don't know if I'm going to remember.
Well, I'm not only
It's at
picturing
least 40
going
some odd feet.
east-west across town, I'm also thinking going north-south. So when you come down First Street West, there's cars on both sides, and now you're going to make the portion where you have to turn right even more narrow, so that wouldn't that cause cars to back up on First Street West?
That while it hasn't been engineered, we assume that the majority of that narrowing would actually be on West Napa Street, because it's already so much wider than First Street West. At least the portion of First Street West South. Oh, look, the diagram's up.
Right, so
There's
I'm looking
actually
at it,
very little bulb out on the south leg of the intersection because it's already very narrow.
I don't see that on this image. So to me, it looks like half of the size of the street on First Street West is now removed by the bulb out.
On the north side of West Napa?
So
Or-
from the top of the diagram,
On the
that's
top,
we're
yes.
on the street here, going
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
The street is now, the turning lane is half as large because it is taken up by the bulb out. That's how I see
There's-
that.
It's taking the space, well, right, it's consuming
Half the
empty, well, it is, but there's still only one lane of traffic now, and there would be one lane of traffic in the future. The width would still be probably 14 feet of that lane instead of what's right now probably 30 feet for a lane. It's really excessive right now. So there's
And it's a hard stop. There's a stop sign there, so it doesn't slow down traffic because you've got to stop.
Okay, so you're saying that if you have just as a traffic engineer, when you have a more narrow intersection, that does not slow traffic? I think it does, car traffic.
narrowing intersections can influence vehicle speeds.
Right, and that's one of a
Definitely.
traffic calming measure is you narrow the intersection.
It is,
right?
and
Yeah.
it's typically used in a situation where you've got speeding. This is a situation where cars are often going 25. They're posted at 25. Most cars are going 25, if not less, because of the congestion in the area. So that you don't see a lot of benefit in from a traffic calming perspective when the speeds are already low, but they do help lower it at the higher speeds.
My point was that it causes traffic calming by slowing traffic, and that the idea here is that it will improve traffic flow, but it is typically used to slow traffic, making traffic even slower. That's
Well, it may
actually my
seem
point.
counterintuitive, but, just because the vehicle is moving slow doesn't mean it can't go through the lane if the pedestrian is taking less time to cross the street. The delay at the intersection isn't so much as in terms of whether a person's going 20 or 25, it's if they have to stop to wait for a pedestrian.
So let me try this. I think what you're essentially asking is that could the traffic analysis examine whether or not creating the bulb outs would create an additional traffic impact for the car turning right from,
Yeah,
okay. So, yes
That's
is
the
the answer to
one.
that question.
yeah.
All right, I have one last question. It's a little bit moot because of your explanation earlier, but just under the terms of CEQA, and my understanding was that if a project was not compliant with a city's land use laws, then that was a significant impact. And here we have a 50% housing requirement that has not yet been waived. So therefore, because the project doesn't comply with our land use laws as they're written and unwaived, wouldn't that be required as an alternative or to be addressed in the EIR?
All right, I'd like to take a shot at that. First, as we've already gone over in the initial staff report on the appeal and earlier tonight, the fact that the project proposal does not propose a residential component is not considered, at least by staff, to be a significant land use impact. And that's based on a number of factors. First, in terms of general plan consistency, a residential component within a development on this site isn't mandated in the general plan. The definition of the commercial zone set forth in the community development element makes no reference to a housing component. There are no policies or implementation measures in the community development element, the housing element, or any other element of the general plan that mandate a residential component on the subject property. In addition, the subject property is not identified in the housing element inventory of housing opportunity sites. So the general plan is kind of a key issue in this analysis. If this project were found to be inconsistent with the general plan, on this issue or any other issue, then indeed that would be considered a potentially significant impact. But a project can vary, for example, from the normal requirements of the development code, which is where this residential component comes in to play, and we wouldn't necessarily say that constituted a significant impact. For example, if someone is looking for a setback exception from the development code, they can go through the Planning Commission and apply for a setback exception. We're not calling that a significant impact, even though it strays from the normal requirements of the development code, because it just doesn't rise to a level of a policy conflict in terms of land use law. A second factor, and this is related to the first, is that the potential requirement of a housing component in conjunction with commercial development on sites of 1/2 acre in size or larger, that is set forth in the development code, not the general plan, and those provisions specifically allow for it to be reduced or waived entirely at the discretion of the Planning Commission. So there's built into the requirement is the waiver of the requirement. So there too, the fact that the applicant is requesting a waiver is not in conflict with the development code. It's allowed in the development code. It's specifically called out as an option that an applicant has. And lastly, the development code provisions addressing the residential component were not established for the purpose of mitigating any environmental impact. So that's the third factor. And Veronica?
So I'll speak to that third factor first, just because I want to be crystal clear about this issue. So in the environmental impact topics that are examined in the environmental impact report, as in almost all environmental impact reports, are patterned after the CEQA guidelines and the initial study checklist questions that are contained within the CEQA guidelines. And of course, the reason for that is you've got to have some standard against which to measure the impacts. This jurisdiction uses the CEQA guidelines as the appropriate yardstick against which to measure. So under land use and planning, the question is relative to conflict with policy, conflict with any applicable land use plan, policy, or regulation of an agency with jurisdiction over the project adopted for the purpose of avoiding or mitigating an environmental effect. So it's not that the CEQA document looks at all possible regulations and plans. The regulation in question has to have been adopted for the purpose of mitigating environmental impacts, and then you look at whether it conflicts with it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is better understood by way of an analogy, I think, the question of the waiver is part of the project description. In other words, much like if someone comes to you and says, I have a project, and my project is I want an amendment to the general plan to change this property from commercial to residential, and I want a subdivision to build 20 homes. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that's the application. The environmental document doesn't analyze the impact associated with the site not being currently a residential land use designation, because part of the project is to change it. So again, for this project, part of the project was to request the waiver. Now, the document does need to examine the impacts associated with the waiver, if there are any. So I don't know if that helps you to make the distinction. So it's not necessarily the case that it didn't examine the impacts. It's supposed to, but it's examining the impacts of the waiver that's been requested, not identifying inconsistency because the waiver's been requested. If you choose not to grant the waiver, then the project isn't approved, at least not in that configuration.
And that does speak to the value of a residential alternative, all of that other discussion aside, because it does give the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council more options in terms of, taking different immediate actions with respect to the project when it comes up for approval.
All right, well, thank you all for patiently listening to all that. Does anyone have any more questions before we launch into our discussion? All right, well, now it is time to discuss. And just as a reminder, so as far as the issue of the appeal, that's sort of the one that we want to iron out first, and that will sort of flow into what our public comment is going to look like. So we're not going to do any motions, I would ask, until after we get to that point.
I did have one question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You can do questions and comments.
Oh, okay. So just in terms of the process, let's say there's a number of things that we'd like to see, assuming, well, in the event that the appeal is upheld, that we want to see in a revised document. When will we receive from, before that work is undertaken, I assume that we'd like to see what alternatives will be put forward, et cetera, et cetera. So how will we know the scope of the work in terms of a revised document?
Well, I would say that we're seeking broad direction from the City Council on that score tonight, that we would take into consideration and try to refine through the draft resolution that would be prepared. And then you would have another look at that when the resolution comes before you.
And how does that differ? When you come up with a proposal, we'll call it a proposal for what might be studied additionally, how is that different than a scoping hearing meeting?
Well, I'm going to let Veronica kind of address the technicalities of that question, but I guess the way I look at it is that this appeal has served as a scoping session. You have received many comments from members of the public as to, things that they would like the EIR to address differently or be supplemented with. And now it's up to you to take those comments into account as you give us your direction.
So I think that's accurate. A scoping session is for an environmental document where you're starting anew. In other words, it's not to correct the infirmities, if any there are, or bring forward the changes that the council or the planning commission has dictated prior to certification. What essentially a scoping session is tell us all of what you think you are concerned about public. Well, we've heard that at both the scoping session and the hearing before the Planning Commission and the appeal hearings before this body. I think we have a pretty good sense of what the public is looking for relative to the environmental document, at least what they think should or shouldn't be in it. But I do think that to the extent that the council is interested in saying, look, relative to the appeal, we feel that these things need improvement in the document, and staff's identified two that we think need improvement, and you expanded on one of those, for instance, this evening. I think that is valuable information. We would be looking for that information from the council this evening in order to bring that forward in the actual resolution so that everybody understands what's being, I'll call it revised in the document to be recirculated. A little bit of the refinement of those, however, in particular talking about alternative sections comes out of the iterative process with the environmental consultant. In other words, because sometimes you're looking for a sweet spot. What would reduce this impact? Well, if we had one less unit, it might reduce that impact. So we wouldn't want to decide, okay, it will be 8, and then find out 9 would be the threshold of a significant reduction. So we try not to get too far into the fine line details, because as the consultant is actually rolling out the analysis, sometimes there are minor modifications to those alternatives in order to address hitting that spot of what gives us a benefit out of that alternative.
So you're going to take into consideration the comments that have been made by the public and the developer and the appellant and also the city council, and put all of that together in your proposed undertaking that we will look at the next meeting on this
Well,
matter?
we take our direction from the city council. That's what we're looking for.
Okay, so
I
all
mean,
of the
that's what
comments
I
of the
would say.
public are not going to be, only what we say, not the comments and feedback we've heard from the public or anyone else is going to be considered? Is that correct?
To the extent that you direct specific changes to the document, then certainly we would be looking to make sure that the questions of the public relative to those specific changes were addressed. Does that make sense? But let's just say one member of the public stood up and said, I think this document was inadequate because it didn't address, help me with something that I can't even think of.
Well, I've got an example. I mean, a member of the public asked for a, completely different analytical method to be used in the analysis of greenhouse gas emissions, and no such method exists. So we wouldn't propose to undertake that.
So I'm thinking more about for example, we received a letter from the appellant's attorney, Rose Zoya, and I forget, it had 5 or 6 items on it that she wanted to be in the revised document assuming the appeal were upheld. So, for example, on those matters, would those have to be, of those that we agreed with, would those have to be directed by the city council for you to act on them? Or would you, having received feedback, much of it valuable, say, we did receive that feedback on my own as the planning director, I agree, if we're going to look at it again, we might as well do that as well. So will it be limited to what we direct you, or will you also use your own judgment and experience to fill out the rest?
Yes. We would also use our own judgment and experience to just address, other kinds of deficiencies that this would be an opportune time to correct.
But certainly to the extent that the council directs something, we won't be ignoring something you direct, even if that wouldn't have been of our own initiative.
We're not going to be just completely literal about this. Yeah.
So I think what we're talking about then is on page 4, that the EIR be amended. This is the part that you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah, so I think now I think we need to come to a sense of, as far as the question of the appeal, whether we want to deny the appeal and certify the EIR, or whether we want to take staff's direction and uphold the appeal and possibly direct some amendments and revisions and recirculation. But that, if everyone could reveal where they are on that. Who
I'm
wants to
very
go first?
comfortable. I'm sorry. I'll let you stop. No, because I'd like to hear from you're a planning commissioner. Lay that baby out there.
Well, I will go.
Yeah.
So, I want to get back to the process and back to the planning commission and give this, if we're gonna review and revise this EIR, I want to send it back to the planning commission and go through whatever option 1 was. If you can put that back up there, David, would be great. I look at this project, I've been involved in it since 2012 as a planning commissioner, and I can't believe we're still here, but it's, we are where we're at. And I don't want to get into responses about deliveries and things like that, because if anybody sitting on this panel knows how delivery trucks work in this town, I do, because that's the business that I'm in. I look at this as, I'm also keeping in mind I think there's at least 83 units that I know that are being built here, housing units and so on, and there's some other projects coming down the pike with affordables, and we have an affordable project on Broadway. We have lots of housing opportunities that are happening, and we may get to the point where we're building so much housing that we say, gee, I wish we didn't build so much housing because we have so much traffic now. I think about all the planning commission meetings that I've been through with, when you talk about mixing housing and commercial, how we end up with, housing ends up creating more traffic than commercial use does. But I'm reminded about the Constitution of the United States, about people's rights to develop their property and do the best thing for the community. And I've heard a lot through this entire process about people hammering on individuals because of their name or what they do for a living or and things like that, which is very troublesome to me. And then we talk about the public being here, but there's almost 11,000 of them that are not here in this room. And that's about what our population is now, is about 11,000. And what I'm hearing is, from a lot of folks is, what's wrong with this city council? How come you're not moving this thing along? How come we're going to drag it on for another year or 2 or 3 or 4 and see what happens? But, I'm concerned that we keep kicking this thing down the road. I want to go with option 1. Let's get moving on it. Let's figure out how to do it right so everybody ends up being happy with it and get going.
Thank you. Who's
There's
next?
other things to do.
Well, thank you, Gary. See, I knew you could roll that one out. And I think, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I just want to make sure that when our staff says we will have those planning commissioners, there's a lot to go through. We have these options that were presented to us, and we still haven't come back to how that's going to work. So I think I need a commitment of some kind to say that this is actually going to happen. So what sticks out to me is, while the EIR found that the project could result in significant impacts in several areas, mitigation measures were identified that would reduce potential impacts to a less than significant level. So that's something that really stuck with me. I, like Gary, would like to see it go back to the Planning Commission as long as we are promised, and it does happen, that there will be a Planning Commission of that size. And I believe that it should be amended, that's what we're offering, and also recirculated.
Just jumping back to 2012, the process does work when the Planning Commission is fully staffed. Because when this project came originally, it was a French chateau, and the folks are here. And the Planning Commission to say, hey, guys, come on, you got to go back. And the dozens and dozens of meetings that have happened, I do believe the process works, and we have to get back to where we're fully staffed. And I agree with you, Madeline, that let's just get it done and move on.
Yeah, thanks.
With the Planning Commission, too.
Okay, I am for upholding the appeal with giving staff direction with regard to the improvements. I don't know what the right words are. We'd like to see. I think that the city council should retain jurisdiction over the EIR. I'm not persuaded by the chart that's being shown now with regard to the timeline. I think that there's no reason the city can't have the use permit teed up for the Planning Commission the week after the EIR hearing happens. I don't see the delay there. I think that this is an incredibly complicated document that requires a tremendous amount of public comment and thought, and it is anticipated that we will have essentially a fairly new planning commission at the time this is heard. I don't think this is a good first step for a novice planning commissioner. We have all invested a tremendous amount of time reading the thousands of pages that have been put before us, and I think that this body is the best prepared to critically analyze the EIR and address the issues that are before it, and that it is somewhat burdensome to ask people to go through this again when we are doing it. And also, we have reviewed the first documents and are asking for the changes. And so that's an additional burden for someone to get up to speed on why we went through this whole process, what changes we asked to be made, and what are the results of those changes. And so for, you know, as an attorney, I just sort of think of like, well, if I had my case before a judge and I explained the entire case to the judge, and then they said, oh, well, next time a different judge is going to hear your case, I mean, gosh, that doesn't even make sense to me. I would be very disappointed with that. So I don't think that the delay, given, you know, staff's willingness to tee up the use permit hearing at the planning commission level, I don't think the delay is significant. And I think that it is in everyone's interest to have the most studied persons on this issue just review get the thing done, review it here, and call it a day. And so I am kind of adamantly in favor of option 2.
Mr. Cook?
Yeah, could you go ahead and put the first slide back on that you had? Because I just want to talk a little bit about the timeline. I liked what Councilmember Edwards, or Vice Mayor Edwards, said about bringing it back to the Planning Commission. I believe that the Planning Commission's role is an important one in the city of Sonoma and all other jurisdictions. I guess my biggest concern, and Councilmember Harrington did say that, you know, we're going to have probably a relatively new Planning Commission, or we might have a lot of individuals on there that have served before. That's going to happen later on. But I think bringing it back to the council and having us jurisdiction, I'm reminded by the tour bus situation that we have on the plaza, the deficit in the cemetery, all these things that I heard Monday night from the public asking the council to do something. And I went home, and if I would have had a dog, I mean, I think the poor dog would have heard me speak for about 2 or 3 hours. I was upset because we're bringing things to the you know, to this agenda, and they're not getting on right now. So bringing something back to the council to deal with an EIR, when I really believe that the big important issue here is a use permit. It's just using up staff time more and more at the council level. That's what we have a planning commission for. So that's why I'm supporting you know, option number 1. And not to throw anybody under the bus, because that's not what I'm here. I'm not here to throw staff under the bus. But what I heard Monday night was a clear message from my constituents that are telling me this council needs to start acting. We have a major tour bus issue. I've got pictures of them unloading on the street. Has nothing to do with this item. So the only reason I'm bringing it up, because it does when we're talking about what the city council's role is in the city of Sonoma. If you read the letters to the editor, if you read all this, these 11,000 people that Vice Mayor Edwards is talking about, they're not here, but they're screaming that this council needs to start doing something. So I would like to see this go back to the Planning Commission. But I did have one question, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. If it goes back to the Planning Commission, when would the EIR be certified? In this process, option 1. And by whom?
Well, it would be certified by the Planning Commission, and that would occur approximately in February.
Okay. So if that happens in February of 2018, and then there is an appeal, there could be an appeal on that, correct?
Of course.
Can you go back to that slide, please?
Yes, I'm sorry, this keeps cutting out. I'm not certain why.
Because what I'm
There we
trying
go.
to figure out is the timeline. I think the city of Sonoma, we need to start action, and we need to quit kicking things down kicking the can down the road. I don't really see, unless there's something where, if there was an appeal on the EIR, where that would take place.
Well, under the option at the top of the slide, option 1, the Planning Commission would hear both the use permit, would hear both the EIR and the use permit at the same hearing, and they would take action on both. And that way, if there were an appeal, the council would be hearing one appeal and would not be in a situation where it would be hearing multiple appeals, potentially of an EIR certification followed by a use permit. Certainly it's also true that under option 2, there could be no appeal of the EIR certification because the council would have done that itself. But it does result in an extra step, as reflected in the chart.
But you're telling me that if it got appealed back to the city council, it would be if the EIR and the use permit would both come to the council at the same
Correct.
time?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Oh, yeah, totally.
But this all depends on what we feel should be amended, what we need, our instructions to you. Is that correct? That's true. It could
Certainly.
be 5 things, it could be 5 things, or
Or less.
12. That's what I wanted, to hear. Because we're talking about something and we don't remember, or possibly we have control over how this will move. So, and I think that's what you were saying.
So it sounds like we have a vote to uphold the appeal and have some amendments or revisions and recirculate. That is certainly the way that I'm going to be voting. We're all on the same page here. As far as who is it going to go to, I see the rationale behind sending it to the Planning Commission, but I mean, part of me, just out of frustration for pretty much everybody in the room, but including the developers of just how long this has been going on, I feel like if the EIR that we are now sort of like dictating goes to the Planning Commission and then it gets appealed on both things, and everyone ends up talking about the EIR at least 2 more times, where if just the EIR that we are asking for comes to us, then we're only talking about the EIR 1 time. And I understand that there's the concern that when we have these EIR hearings, that people come out and they talk about use permit things anyway, and we're just going to end up with longer meetings. But I feel like the sensible thing would be for it to come back to us, because we're the ones that are going to dictate what's in it. But it sounds like we might have a majority for sending it to the Planning Commission, which is fine. So now at this point that we have, we're pointing in a direction, I would like to ask my council if they would support going out to the public for public comment. And the public comment would be specifically about suggestions for revisions to the EIR and anything related to recirculation. So kind of focusing on this document and ways that you would like to see it made better. And that is what public comment would be about. And again, it would not be about whether you do or do not like hotels. So does everyone feel good about us doing that? All right, so at this point, we will go out to public comment.
Just, Mayor Henley, at
After
the end,
this.
at the conclusion of public comment, or if there's some questions, I would like to take a 10-minute break before council kind of takes their motion. So just want some time to pull a few things together, if we could just, thanks.
Okay, that sounds good. So at this point, I will be opening public comment. We will be limited to 3 minutes. And again, we are talking about the EIR, and specifically suggestions for moving forward with revisions, recirculation, et cetera.
Good evening, Council. Larry Barnett, 5th Street East. First, I want to just say that I'm very pleased the applicant has joined us in advocating taking a step back in this process to further examine the issues and the impacts. And any scoping or recirculation and amending will serve the interests of the applicant and the community alike. The more information we have, the better the outcome is going to be, and I've been advocating that from the beginning. I'd like to advocate that this come back to the council. Some of the reasons I've heard that the council suggested are the same as what my concerns would be, which is essentially, you now have more information than the new planning commission's going to have. You've heard the issues, you've read the issues, you're more up to speed on everything attendant to this than a group of commissioners who haven't been exposed to any of this material will have. And it's certainly my hope that that we can resolve this issue and the next iteration, and that will be that, and we can move on to the next phase of this process. In terms of the scope of what it is you're going to be looking at, we submitted a document to the council after the close of the last hearing, which proposed a sample housing component to this project that ended up with 24 housing units of varying sizes using approximately 43% of the built area. It reduced the size of the inn or the hotel based on its current design and square footage. And certainly, as staff goes ahead and develops an alternative that has to do with housing, I think they should be using something that considers difference of sizes and scale of different type of housing units, as well as the total square footage required under the development code. I think to the public and most of us out here, the distinction between mandate and required is pretty thin. To me, required is mandated. Now, I understand there may be some specific legal implications when one's associated with land use versus development code, but the development code and the general plan essentially constitute a policy document, the implementation measures and the rules and regulations for how you essentially attain the goals of the general plan. It works together as a piece. You can't break it up into pieces and say this isn't a land use issue because it's in the development code. The fact of the matter is the word required is used unless waived. That seems pretty clear to me. I speak English. I don't know why it's particularly confusing to anybody about how one responds to a requirement unless waived. I think that the project description obviously should include the waiver in it, that the large truck deliveries and all of the items listed in Rose Zoya's letter in which she reiterated the points of the appeal, I would hope the council would look at. I don't know if you have a copy with you tonight, but I do have a copy for you if you don't. And that uses up my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Thomas Jones. I live up on Viewcrest Drive in Diamond A. I appreciate the comments that have just been made. I think if I had to make a recommendation about the adequacy of the EIR, is there should be some context beyond this project for understanding the environmental impact review. Mr. Edwards mentioned other things that are going on in the city that I think need to be taken into consideration, because the thing that bothers me most about all of the comments that have been made leading up to the appeal is that this project is being made to hold the burden for everything from global warming to understanding affordable housing to solving traffic problems. It is a single project within a larger context, and therefore how it resonates with the overall development of this city is terribly important. As to whether or not this EIR kind of consideration should be going to the council or the planning commission, I have to tell you that this evening I lost some of the confidence I would have had that there was a complete understanding about all of the issues of this EIR on the part of the city council members. I believe that some of the questions that were asked and some of the ways in which they were asked reflected to me not the kind of understanding that I've gotten over 5 years of reading these documents, which what I've hoped you would have all had. I would have more confidence in the Planning Commission, whose sole job it is to do this, rather than to be burdened with all of the other issues which Mr. Cook pointed out need to be solved by the council. I don't mean to insult or even impugn anybody's intelligence. It is just that there is a lot on your plate. And I agree that the EIR consideration for the whole context of the city of Sonoma is better handled at the Planning Commission first, and the recommendations then respectfully forwarded to the body that has the ultimate decision. That's you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Carla Noyes, 15549 Brookview Drive, Sonoma. We are here, and we've been here since 2012. This is one of the most important issues in the city of Sonoma since, hotel proposed on the hill. This is important. You are informed. The new Planning Commission. And I know we're to address things that we want to see whoever it is address. Honestly, I'm a little tired, and that we have to say this again and again and again. You know what's important? It's the traffic, it's the trucks, it's the bike lanes, it's the congestion. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Heidi Darling, Communications Director for the First Treaties Project. I'm going to comment a little bit about the process overall and echo some of the sentiments I've heard tonight about just that it's taken too long and it's a bit muddled. As fellow developers, we fully appreciate the challenges of attempting to build new projects in Sonoma. The current process is resource intensive, polarizing within our community, and opaque. Let's be fair, it's broken. We'd like to point out that we recognize the dire need for housing. Designing a project to provide market rate housing while also providing a small boutique inn to generate TOT dollars is no easy feat. It's taken us thousands of hours and years of listening and revising our plans to get to this point. Now, like the applicant before you, we are facing a costly EIR with no clear answer on the other side. This is a dysfunctional process with serious downside consequences for Sonoma. If Sonoma is serious about wanting to add housing, jobs, or approaches to smart tourism, like ours and the applicant before you, our leadership needs to get serious and work effectively with developers to streamline what is now a prohibitively cumbersome process. We are equally attuned to residents' strong desire to have a say in what gets developed in their Sonoma. This spirit is part of what makes Sonoma a special place to live, yet we're wasting it by making people participate in an impossibly vague process to be heard. I'm here tonight to request that the City Council provide transparency, critical transparency, which benefits all current and future applicants, current and future citizens, and the city staff by reducing valuable time and money that is currently being wasted due to a broken system. In addition to firmly believing City Council members should be proactively involved and free to meet with and express their views openly to applicants and the opposition, there are some other easy ways to remove the opaqueness and add the much-needed transparency everybody wants. The simplest proven way is an advisory vote process, which allows the City Council to take a position on any issue, project, or proposal in a non-binding fashion for the purpose of guidance and expediency. Simply put, an applicant facing an imminent appeal could come before you, present the best case for the project, and based on this information, you'd provide guidance. This would force modifications to projects you don't support and fast-track those you want to see completed that benefit the community. It's often the simplest solutions, like an advisory vote process, that can be the most appreciated game changers. Let's change the game and avoid another 6-year quagmire like the applicant, the Planning Commission, and the city staff and yourselves have been wading through on the project before you. Let's change the game.
Thank you.
Hi, Fred Allebach, 19550 Street East, and I have a specific suggestion about the pop-outs, and if there's going to be a bike lane there, that's going to, whenever I come down Napa Street East and come to a pop-out and there's a car behind me, I'm scared I'm going to get hit by a car or truck. So I don't see a bike lane there with the big trucks turning. That's going to be problematic for bike safety. So I think that that's something to look into, and that the diagram there on the screen did not have a bike lane in it. So if you saw a bike lane on there with the pop-outs, that's going to be a serious safety issue. I'd also like to make a comment on the use permit hearing and the EIR. Having the residential component in the EIR gives validity to an existing city policy, which is that commercial property of a certain size should be 50% residential. And so I would suggest that there be a separate hearing for the EIR and the use permit hearing. Staff said before that the use permit hearing is a time when the 50% residential component could be considered aside from the EIR. But now the tune has changed, and now we're going to lump them together. So I think that makes it so public comment is not not separate from the EIR impact issues from the character issues of town, which would be in the use permit hearing. So if you put them together, you're going to be mixing two whole different things. And so I would strongly suggest that you have the use permit hearing a week afterwards so that the public can comment on those character issues aside from environmental impact issues. And then also I would like to make a comment about one comment I made in the EIR was about the city council's goal of balancing tourism and city character. And so I think that's sort of a back text here for what the 11,000 people of Sonoma want and what a lot of people in Sonoma would like to see that balance. It's not a vocal minority, and that you have some kind of silent majority of people who want to have more and more tourism on the plaza. You have a serious issue here, and to have a 65-room hotel, an 80-seat restaurant right off the plaza is an intensification of tourism that maybe a lot of people don't want. So the EIR is an opportunity to tone that down a little bit and to tone some of these projects down so that the character of the town will stay. You're going to have something there. You're going to have some tourism, but let's moderate it a little bit. And I think that's what the essential feeling of the appeal and a lot of the 11,000 people who live here would like to see some balance and not see such a big project on the plaza. Thank you.
Thank you.
Council and Mayor Hundley. I'm Georgia Kelly. I'm on Mitchell Way in Sonoma. And I know people have been talking a lot about how long we've been talking about the hotel and what's happening with it on the plaza and how we feel about it. So it's been 5 years, but we could live with this project for a lot longer than 5 years. So I think it's very important to take the time we need to make sure we have something we can live with in our town. Those of us who moved here are seeing it not as a tourist mecca, but as a place where we could really feel community. This is getting destroyed, and I think many of you see that happening, where tourism is becoming more important than the residents who live in the town. So a few things I want to comment about the EIR. One is what Fred already mentioned about those bow-outs. I know when I first moved to this town, the one at 5th Street, at least it seems like a bow-out at 5th Street and Napa, 5th Street West and Napa, I hit that curb so many times when I first moved here, and I think a lot of people probably do. I got a flat tire on one of them, and I expect that cars that will be turning on those bow-outs won't even know how sharp they have to turn in order to avoid hitting the curb. So that's another thing to really consider, is how are people going to drive around these, and especially how are trucks going to navigate them. Regarding sending this back to the Planning Commission, which I really disagree with, and there are a few reasons for that. One is it is in front of you right now, and it's come here because it was appealed from the Planning Commission decision. And the Planning Commission also really didn't thoroughly investigate the EIR, or they wouldn't have approved it 4-1. And even the developers now realize there needs to be changes with the EIR. So if the Planning Commission didn't catch it the first time, my guess is there's going to be an appeal again if it goes back to the Planning Commission. So I'd really like those of you who think it shouldn't be staying with the council to reconsider that before you vote tonight, because it will come back again, and it's going to be a lot longer process if it goes back to the Planning Commission. And the last thing is pedestrian traffic, which I've been talking about from day one with this project. A lot of the traffic of cars on the plaza is not just because there are cars around the plaza, it's also because there are many pedestrians walking between in the crosswalks and even outside the crosswalks in between the streets. So there's lots of pedestrian traffic that's causing a backup of cars. It's going to be a lot more intense if you've got a hotel with 62 rooms, a restaurant with 82 seats, parking for 113 cars. I think there's going to be a lot more traffic and a lot more pedestrians. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Bill Hooper with Kenwood Investments. I'm project applicant, 144 West Napa Street. First, I want to comment on the piecemealing, because I'm not sure it was answered adequately. We're looking at using either the Lynch building or our own office building across the street for administrative uses. Understand that those buildings exist today and they have office administrative uses in them. They're fully occupied buildings whose traffic, water use, sewer use is happening now with or without the hotel. So I think it's very important the traffic study does take that into consideration because it exists now. It's part of the existing traffic. So I just wanted to clarify that. The SIT building is fully leased by Crave, Sonoma Brands, and the Index Tribune. Those are 10-year leases, so we did not build that as some circumnavigation of the EIR process. Any buildings we would use, if Kenwood Investments has to move, it will have to move to an existing building if it wants to make way for hotel admin. Same thing with a possible tenant that exists in the Lynch building. So wanted to clarify that. A few years ago, I was approached at the grocery store to sign a petition to try to kill a hotel project that was going to create traffic nightmares. It was a pretty compelling argument if you believe that on its face. What's great about the EIR process, and the reason we were supportive of participating in it, even though it wasn't required, is that it would get data on the table that's factual, done by professionals who don't have a stake in this. That's what's before you. We've always listened to the community. We want to continue to listen to the community. That's why we don't feel that the EIR is flawed now, but we feel like the community wants more information. So all the comments that were made, we're supportive of that being in the study. Let's study it. It's worth the extra time. So, we're in a much different place than we were in a few years ago when that petition was proposed to me. We have a lot more data on the table now about traffic. So let's keep studying it. Let's look at the bump outs. Let's look at the pedestrian crosswalk. We agree with all of that. It's been the spirit of our proposal all along to work with the community. We've made radical changes in the project, and we'll continue to listen as we did a few weeks ago when we were here and as we did tonight. So we're supportive of however the council wants to go with this, and we'll put in the extra time and effort to stand by for improvements to the EIR. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Diane Lumiere. I live at 113 Merida Drive in Sonoma. This is my first time at this hearing, and I've been aware of this process going on. I don't think what's been considered here is that because of the increasing traffic on the plaza, a lot of the side streets are being impacted by cars that try to circumvent West Napa Street. And as a result of that, a lot more traffic is going on the little streets. They go down West 5th Street instead of going through West Napa and go on the little side streets to get into town. And that has become an enormous problem. There's a small elementary school right off of that area where now traffic is going down that I don't think has been addressed by this project. And I haven't heard it here tonight. And so I'm just curious if that has come up yet, because it's, if you live here, you really see the difference in traffic and you see where it's going. It's, if you build here or just visit here, you don't see it. But if you live here, it's just enormously important not to take the impact of this development and make locals have to kind of try to make their way around town some other way. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Armando Zimmerman. I live on West Spain Street between 2nd and 3rd. And my question relates to tonight's description of the meeting, and in particular, the project consists of 62-room hotel, 80-seat restaurant, and 115 off-street parking. My question is, is that a minimum, the 115 off-street parking? I'm looking at the possibility of full occupancy of the 62 rooms, full staffing to run that hotel, a great night at the restaurant, maybe 80 people there, and those cars, probably a lot of people would walk. Some people would walk, many would drive. And so the comment at the bottom, which says potential off-street parking, I'm just not clear on whether that's a real possibility. Is it a perceived need? So again, the big question is 115 enough? I live on, like I say, West Spain Street. I know that business employees already spill out to where I live. They come and park. I don't know if that's a personal preference on their part or whether they don't have enough parking within the business or provided by the business or provided, within the city closer to where their business is. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll ask that question at the end.
Good evening, Sheila O'Neill, Protect Sonoma, and this year's president of the North of Mission Neighborhood Association. My comments regarding the EIR, I'm going to echo some comments that were heard earlier. CEQA does not require an environmental impact review on a project which will not be approved. This project has already gone down the EIR path. For future projects, we have the opportunity to save everybody a lot of time if we understand that critical factor. CEQA does not require an environmental impact review on a project which will not be approved. If we have the opportunity to look at whether or not we're going to approve a project first in its conceptual stage, we can get the environmental impact report on a project that we actually believe in, that we support. Instead of spending all this time, all this money, ending up going through potentially 2 or 3 environmental impact reviews, years of time, so much of your time, so much of the staff's time, so much of the developer's money. So please keep that in mind. CEQA does not require an environmental impact review on a project which will not be approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, members of the City Council. I'm Carol Marcus, 873 First Street West. I just want to say that it was a community effort that went into the making of the general plan and the development code, particularly the general plan, which is implemented by the development code. So, and it's important to look at the words in that carefully. It seems to me that the housing requirement has been taken rather lightly, and it's been called discretionary, and it can be waived. Yeah, it can be waived, but there have to be findings made in order for it to be waived. And financial hardship is not one of those findings. I don't have them right in front of me, but site constraints are one of them, and there's a few others. So I think we need to really take seriously the conditions under which the housing can be required. So as I see it, there's a minimum as is required in the development code, which is implementing, and it is a policy in the housing element, I might add. It's a minimum of 50% housing that's required. And yes, it can be waived if findings are made. So I would suggest that the alternatives that are considered as the new EIR is looked at, consider a minimum of 50% housing. I would also really like to see the scope of the traffic study enlarged to encompass, as a resident of First Street West and realizing that the loading dock for this project is on First Street West, I can totally imagine delivery trucks coming down First Street West all the way to MacArthur, where there's a 4-way stop and it's easy to make a left turn there. And I have concerns about that. So I would love to see just the geographic scope of the traffic study widened a bit to include that residential area down there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment this evening?
Vic Conforti, 755 Broadway. I just wanted to reiterate some comments I made previous hearings, mainly about the plaza. from my point of view, it's sort of the elephant in the room. It's our heart and soul. It's what makes Sonoma what it is, really, to have a beautiful center like this right in the middle of town. And most importantly, it's listed on the National Registry of Historic Places, the Plaza District, which includes the park, the historic buildings surrounding the park, down East Spain Street, past 2nd Street. All the historic homes are contributors to this district, some down West Spain Street. So the surrounding, immediate surrounding neighborhood. And the issue in my mind is the congestion that is created by not only hotels, but tourism in general. And there's never been any analysis of the kind of a baseline data, hard data, on how many thousand people come to the plaza on a given weekend day, or we know some of this information on the races and the big events and big plaza events, but not just the daily use of the plaza, both pedestrian and vehicular issues. But without that data, we're kind of just blindly making subjective decisions about, it's either a big impact, is the cumulative impact of another hotel an issue, or isn't? We don't really have that information. So I think that should be included in the revised study, the impact report. And then also just one comment on the housing issue. The housing 50% goal is to avoid the impact that we're experiencing right now of a housing shortage. That was the whole purpose of adding a 50% requirement for commercial and mixed-use projects, consciously aware of the fact that we were coming into a housing shortage, and here we are, full-blown housing shortage. So it's not something that doesn't have impacts. It is. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Did Dave, were you able to get that?
Yes, that was distributed to the
Okay,
council.
great. Thank you, Dave.
All right, is there any further public comment on this item? Mr. Fern?
I'd like to make a statement tonight. Just briefly, I've talked to you before about the national...
Your name and address.
Oh, sorry. Patricia DeFern, and I'm at 465 East MacArthur Street. I've talked to you before about in jeopardy our National Historic Landmark status is. And with regards to the EIR, I don't believe that the mitigations that have been mentioned, which were mentioned early on in the game, are accurate anymore. I'm fearful that this is truly a sequenced, a piecemealed project. And I think that's because they join parking. And there are rentals there that may leave, and it'll be awfully attractive for that project to have the owners move into the business. So then you have that. Beyond that, I fear that future plans to extend into the Bank of Marin parking could be a third attempt at another project in the future. Sonoma, with its moderate scale, is identified with quaint boutique hotels and beautifully restored homes and historic buildings. We can look to MacArthur Place, which can be called a boutique hotel by its own history, the former Good Estate. Approximately the same size with 60 press rooms, a hotel, and a spa. The glaring difference is MacArthur Place is on 6 acres with many of the original trees and many beautiful plantings. The Sonoma Hotel is a Jenga-style 3-story construction on a mere 1.24 acres, with walls reaching the maximum 35 foot with waived allowances for HVAC, and with a mansard roof, which is also beyond the limit. This is accomplished by removing all the 55 trees and the landscaping on the property. The EIR called the mass and clear-cutting insignificant to the bordering historic district. To get a good feel of the immensity of the project, you only have to sit
in the courtyard of the Red Grape, where you now stare at the stark beige 3-story wall of the Lynch remodeled building, which is a remodeled building, which contributes to its piecemeal, realizing there will be a huge hotel structure replacing the adjacent stretch of vine-covered tall fencing. And that extends from the very street on one side all the way back. So the view coming from the west will be terrific. Our city planner is misleading the community by not requiring the EIR to have story poles so that the true immensity of this true new construction will not be apparent until it's too late, while demolishing the tin building, which was inaccurately declared insignificant by the EIR. As a longtime citizen, I urge you to consider that it's your charge as elected officials to uphold my appeal of the EIR, which it sounds like you'll do, and to let the citizens have the opportunity to see what discussions are for the future. I hope we do end up with a beautiful boutique hotel that we can all enjoy. And
Thank
I
you
hope,
very much.
Yeah, thank you for doing your part in this.
Thank you. Any further public comment on this item, or at all tonight, because this is your only shot? All right, seeing none, I will bring it back to the council. I guess at this point, before we end this with a vote, I think now is the time to give direction, or do we want to take a 10-minute break?
Yeah, if we just take a brief
Sure.
10-minute break and come back, thank you.
All right, 10-minute break. This meeting back to order. Do you guys want to say anything before we?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one brief comment that I just want to, and then maybe some other things from public comment that the council wants to talk about. Councilmember Agramonte had asked the question about the new, kind of the planning commission, and with council's direction to have individual appointments for planning commission, which we'll be bringing back, would be the timing of potentially a new or planning commission be seated in this time. So we just talked through the timing of sequence. We'll be coming to back to council with kind of direction and some of those implementation measures in the next 30 days, and getting some more refined feedback. There are some other choices you still need to give us. But as we've looked at it, we believe that you could have whatever your new planning commission is, or reseating, but a new composition based on your direction by early November, which should generally work with this process. However, it's important to note that the first thing that this planning commission that you will be moving forward with, this would be the first item out of the box that they would be dealing with. So I just wanted that clarity because Councilmember Agramonte asked that question. They can be seated, but they will be, again, maybe you'll be reappointing some folks with some experience, but potentially there are also new individuals that have not had that experience. So I just wanted to provide that clarity for your decision making on which way we go.
Thank you. And I wanted to, it reminded me that we had one question I wanted to ask Mr. Goodison. It was about the parking spaces, the 115, and where that fits into, I guess, the requirements of the project and what happens if everything was fully booked.
Well, in terms of parking, that's looked at somewhat indirectly in the environmental review process because compliance with parking standards per se is not something that, or lack thereof, is not in and of itself considered an environmental impact. But that said, if a project creates problems that can be documented as reasonably projected to cause problems as a result of a lack of parking, such as parking in residential neighborhoods, then that is an issue that is a subject of environmental review. Now, in this instance, a parking analysis has been prepared, it's been peer-reviewed, and that parking analysis found that the project under peak conditions could fall short by approximately 7 parking spaces during certain periods of time of peak demand. And so, therefore, rather late in the process, a method was found to try to address that issue involving the parking lot across the street. So this is an area where, again, whether this had come up or not, I think we would have wanted to do this because it makes sense, where the project description would be modified to account for that possibility of making use of the Bank of Marin parking so that it is fully integrated in the EIR analysis.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
I think so. So now at this point, we are going back to the direction portion of the evening. So I guess we'll go back through, and from what I'm understanding, if you hear something in the public comments that you like, you should reiterate it so that it goes on to the official council direction.
I think that's true with the exception of the fact that staff is, unless council wants to go away from the staff recommendation and what has been concurred in, if you will, by the applicant and the attorney for the appellants relative to traffic and the alternatives analysis. Unless you have something different to add to that, it would be staff's intent to I'll call it beef up or modify those areas. So I don't think you have to go over that ground again. We're solid on that one. But if there's something you want to add, or if you want to take something away, then certainly you should let us know what that might be.
All right. Who wants to get us started?
Do you want to go first? I have to yield to you. You have the experience. Well, the things I've heard throughout this whole time, of course, is housing, traffic. I think those are the things I've heard. And I actually, and I don't know whether this is part of that process, but I'm very disappointed in our enforcement by the police here in Sonoma. Things just happen all over the streets, meaning backups. Big buses are dropping people off sometimes in front of something, and I would really like to see more enforcement. So I don't know where that fits in this, but I think we have to have some kind of a presence, especially on the plaza, to enforce the pedestrian traffic and cars.
All right.
And that, obviously the traffic generally and housing. And I think this is what our, Mr. Hooper has said, that they're amenable to. Not the police thing, sorry. But that's it.
Mr. Cook?
Well, let's go ahead and speak and say that what the attorney said, I agree with. I appreciate the appellants and I appreciate the developers, both coming to the table, and I think that staff does have, the direction of that. I don't have anything extra, but what I did want to comment, and I wanted to make sure that we weren't putting the cart before the horse, because we had said that we had a 3-2 straw vote, or the mayor said that about it going to the Planning Commission. And I wanted to find out exactly where that was right now to make sure that that was something that would, I'd like to set that in stone tonight. I don't want that to change, because my vote is definitely 100% to have it go back to the Planning Commission.
Well, I imagine whatever is going to happen is going to be in the motion, so that's going to set it straight. And
Yes,
I
we will be
suspect I know
asking
which
for
way
a
that one's
motion,
gonna go.
including jurisdiction.
So we'll know. Anything else? All right.
First of all, I wanted to say with regard to the developer that they are very easy to work with, and I appreciate their willingness to have additional information put into this EIR, and it makes it great for the community and the council and the city staff. So I think that in terms of like best business practices and professionalism, I just want to applaud you for that, because it's been great for everybody and a good outcome and really collaborative, and it says a lot about your project that you have proceeded this way, I think. And with regard to the appellants and to all of the numerous people who have combed through the EIR and given us legal citations and really looked at the underpinnings of all of the assumptions and provided so much thought and data, thank you so much. It's again, a testament to the intelligence and commitment of our community that we have people like that here who would do that. And I have learned a tremendous amount from everyone involved. And I just want to, thank you for, I know you did it for the exact same reason we're all in the city council, because we love this town. So I just wanted to recognize that. I have a question, which is I think we should consider offering the appellants a refund of the appeal fee, since it looks like it's going to be upheld. And I don't know when the proper time to do that is, considering they also had to pay for an attorney, and that's their own cost. It's sort of a gesture for, taking the time to bring all this forward. So I don't know when that would happen, but
Sorry. If the council is interested in that, then when we could add that to the agenda when we brought back the formal resolution, and you could act on that.
I'd like to do that. And then with regard to the scope, I guess, and sorry, my iPad's out of battery, so I'm looking at my phone, not looking at my phone for other reasons. Well, I think that I'd like to, I think it makes sense to have the project description include that there is a requested housing waiver. With regard to the traffic study, was the traffic study peer reviewed? The parking was, but the traffic?
The left turn warrant analysis was peer reviewed.
Okay. And so we'll have a more detailed analysis with the bulb outs, and will that be peer reviewed? Can that be peer reviewed?
Well, anything can be peer reviewed. I mean, there are, that's always an option. In terms of a greater analysis of the bulb outs, that's something that, has been requested, and we would attempt to incorporate into the revisions to the EIR. But as far as peer review is concerned, I think we would want to wait and see on the results of that analysis and whether any substantial flaws are identified, because we don't want to just do a peer review for the sake of doing a peer review. There needs to be, in my view, some basis for that. There was a basis for it in the left turn warrant analysis. Maybe there will be in the bulb out analysis, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
I guess my thinking is, of the most contentious points which exist, they are the housing question and the traffic. And to the extent that when it is finally before us, if we have it already peer reviewed to say, yes, we believe that these are the impacts with this mitigation measure, and it's been peer reviewed, that we could more easily move forward. But if that's not the normal process, I'm not trying to change that.
So the one thing about a peer review of the additional information is, of course, there's a cost associated
Sure.
with that. There may also be time associated with it, depending on whether or not another consultant is available. But certainly I think staff can consider the question of peer review or discrete peer review of pieces if there are pieces of it that we feel are, what's the word that I'm looking for? Desirous, that's not the right word here, but that we are desirous of peer review because of the analysis or because of the way the analysis has to happen.
I'd just like to have it whenever it comes back to have, to be in the best shape possible, to not have disagreements about the facts before us. We can decide on the other issues, but hopefully the factual issues will be resolved at that time. I think would be,
Yes.
you know,
That's the goal.
yeah. And then in terms of the alternatives, so those are going to be determined by, just to clarify, they're going to be determined, and we will know which alternatives are going to be examined at the next hearing we have on this matter. Or no. When will we know what alternatives are being examined?
We actually didn't internally talk about this issue at all. I think staff can talk about it if we do give you sort of at the next hearing some generalized parameters. Again, as I said previously, I don't think they would include a level of detail like it will be X number of housing units, or because I think that could move on us. But in terms of sort of more globally, can we come up with, I think more globally we can come
Yes.
up with what they would look like.
Okay. So the only direction I have with regard to alternatives in advance is the question came up about if at the time of the use permit hearing there was a requirement of housing, that if the EIR had already examined more housing, then a new EIR was not going to be needed because it would have less impact than the more housing. So my suggestion and hope would be that we would examine something with a large enough housing component, whether or not that will ultimately be the housing component, so that we don't need additional information at the time of the use permit hearing.
That's something that staff has already discussed among ourselves, so.
Super, that's it.
Mr. Edwards?
So I'm just keeping in mind all of the other things. I never thought I'd be the, I wouldn't say the most history in planning or planning commissions, et cetera, but back when I worked with Ig Vela, Bob Kennard, and all of those folks way in the past, Dick Fogg, who's on the County Planning Commission and otherwise, I can't get out of my head all of the projects that we worked on, have been approved, and the cumulative effect of everything that's gone on. And what I find here is that we're kind of putting everything back onto this one project. But I was part of a lot of different approvals and denials and so on in the past. And I think about, we have a whole plaza that's full of historic buildings that have zero parking requirement. We have restaurants that are, and I won't name them, that were slated for X number of seats and have 2 to 3 times the number of seats. And they just kind of expand on their own because we really don't have the enforcement to go back and review that constantly. Some are in the neighborhood of this project, and we had a couple of speakers talk about, you know, the number of seats and if it was completely full. And I would hope that if a restaurant is built, that it is completely full and that everybody's tucked away in their parking spots when that happens. I don't know if that'll be the fact, because I've had my experience in this town has been when there's commercial buildings that are just empty, where half the plaza was empty at one time in the 25 years that I've lived here. We also have to remember that we have a state highway that runs through the middle of our town. And the amount of driving that I do, I work in Napa, I work in Hayward, I work in Sacramento. I'm kind of all over the place all the time, so I feel pretty intimate with how traffic works here. And sure, there's issues, but we have, and we had some photos that showed up last time of trucks parked in front of the Mission. Yeah, that happens, but you know, like you say, Madeline, we need a little enforcement on that sort of thing. We have all these cutouts in the middle of the street. The guy just needs to run his hand truck a little further down around the corner to La Casa, I think is where that truck was going. We have a lot of exceptions in this town. We have most of First Street East, and between First Street and Napa, Broadway was developed with a giant project that has 0 public parking in it. That happened in the council way before this council, and I still wonder why that happened, but it's there. We have to live with it, but it's kind of a bunch of buildings that there's not really that many people and not that much activity in because it was designed without parking. It has some parking, but it's paid for parking. So as far as, I'm very happy to see that Larry and the group have gotten together with the developer. I think that's great. I'd rather see that people get together and chat. I noticed you guys talking at the last meeting, and I'm happy with what's been presented between the attorney and the developer. And we have to keep in mind that developer's not necessarily a bad word. I mean, developers develop hospitals, they develop preschools, they develop all kinds of things that are very important to our community and the success of our community. And most importantly, they develop affordable housing. And, you know, I think we have a lot of opportunities. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of housing in the pipeline right now. And I don't think that everyone is aware of everything that's coming down the line. I think David might have the most clear opinion on that. But there's more things coming, and you know, as I said earlier, I would like to get past this one so we can get on to issues that are equally as important as this. Thank you.
All right. And let's see. I think my biggest area of focus is traffic related, particularly the bump outs, because just you know, that intersection, particularly that street, it's already a highly impacted street now. It's only going to get worse, and I think that we have to be incredibly cautious to not not be unknowingly adding something to it in the future that's not what we think it's going to be today. So, and just the fact that it kind of, I know that it came up in the context of the circulation element, but then it was suddenly like, you know, popped up as this solution to this problem that we didn't even know we had until recently. So I just want to focus on that, and I think that just for the sake of public confidence in the process, which I think right now is a little bit low, that a peer review of that would be needed, and also the implications on the historic plaza and the fact that it's adding to the plaza. And I just think about what would happen if the city decided that we wanted to add bump outs on the corners to improve traffic. The feedback that we'd be getting from the public on physically changing the shape of the plaza, I think it would be significant. So I just think we need to be really careful about what we're doing there and have, you know, professional opinions on people who know about historic landmarks to make sure that we're not doing something to hurt one of our most prized assets. And then it sounds like everything else has been covered. And then delivery trucks, mainly because First Street West is turning into this delivery truck corridor, and I know that like each one individually is not a big deal, but when you add all of the trucks together, it just seems like it's moving in this direction. So I just want to think carefully about that and have a plan for it. And then to support Amy's suggestion, or Ms. Harrington's suggestion about refunding the fees of the appeal, because I don't think it should take a group of citizens to point out that what we are doing is legally insufficient and should change. So I think that it would be nice to give them a small piece of what they've invested into this so far. And anything else?
Just a point of clarification on one of your comments. You mentioned historical implications on the plaza. You were limiting that to the historical implications of the bulb outs as opposed to anything else, correct?
Yeah, I don't think there'd be anything else that's really touching the you know, physically the inside. And I know there's been changes, the parking's changed and everything, but I just want to make sure we know what we're talking about.
Right. Since we need to go back to that consultant, I just want to make sure what the parameters of what we were asking them were. So, okay.
Exactly. And so I think we're at the point where we need, got another comment?
Just want to add one more comment. When we talk about the threat, which I'm not quite sure where that comes from, about losing our historic designation of the plaza, I don't think that's going to happen. But when you think about it, if you look at the light standards we have, which I don't remember what you call those giant aluminum poles that we have around the plaza, that's where we probably should have lost our historic designation, because that doesn't really fit in with any sort of history that I would agree with. And then as far as the traffic on First Street West, if you did a traffic study on how many trucks come in the middle of the night to the post office, and the amount of parking that is taken up by postal employees, and then you start doing that little piecemeal around with when the former city council overturned the planning commission decision on Pete's Coffee, where you have a couple 100,000 car trips a year into Pete's Coffee, and that whole thing, and with all the traffic that you have with postal employees that park outside during the day, and then there's the Pete's Coffee people park in the post office all day. It's kind of a mess, but when you look at the amount of traffic that's caused there, I think you have to also consider the post office and how much traffic is created by that, even though it happens in the middle of the night for the most part.
Sure. All right, any other comments on this? And then I think it's time for a motion.
What is that thing that we said? I had made a note based on these.
Are you gonna make it, Madeline? Should I make it? Oh,
Yeah, I think what we're going for. I would like to make a motion that make a motion that the EIR be amended and recirculated with the suggestions that have come from this council. So I'm sure that's not the right thing.
So, just a friendly amendment to that, which would be upholding the appeal for those purposes.
All right.
And directing staff to come back at a future meeting with a resolution to that effect.
Upholding the appeal for those purposes.
And my only other question is, because Councilmember Cook brought up, he'd like the motion to include who's getting jurisdiction of this matter back? Are we bringing it back to the council or the planning commission?
And also the fee.
And, well, we'll bring that back and the council can just decide. We'll just bring it back as a subset of the next item when it comes back to you.
Bring it back to the planning commission. Is that what we've said? I think that's what I've heard.
To the council.
Oh, well, planning commission.
You're making the motion.
Yeah,
Well,
it's not very nice.
could we put the fee refund into this, or do we have to wait till the next one?
I would recommend against it
Okay.
because it technically wasn't on the agenda
Got it.
tonight, so I'd rather bring it as an agenda item.
Okay.
Does that help? Does that? All right,
I'll second
you
it.
can interpret that for me.
If I could just excuse for a second, but did your motion have going back to the planning commission?
Yes.
Yes.
I think the motion we have before us is to uphold the appeal with the comments we've just made about the scoping and have the amended EIR go to the planning commission when it's done. I think that's what we were.
That's why I understand the motion.
Thank you.
We have a second?
Yep.
Can I get a roll call vote, please?
Councilmember Cook,
Aye.
Councilmember Harrington,
Aye.
Councilmember Agramonte,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Edwards,
Yes.
Mayor Henley.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. And what's that? Oh, and the appeal passes with a 5-0 vote. Yeah.
And wanted to thank the council for working so hard on this item as well. On behalf of staff, you guys put a lot of work into it too, and you didn't really get a thank you from us, so thank you for so much work.
Well, thank you. This meeting is adjourned.